The loss of Palestine led indirectly to the ruin of the Order of the Templars. The record is one of the dark episodes of history, encompassed with contradictions, full of surprises, painful to contemplate, whatever view may be taken, whichever side espoused. It is difficult to understand how an order of men who for nearly 200 years earned the thanks and praise of Christendom for their bravery and devotion, who had shed blood like water to defend the places dearest to all Christian hearts, who had been recruited from the noblest families in every country in Europe and had had princes of royal blood in their ranks, who claimed to act upon the purest and most exalted Christian principles, and who proved the sincerity of their professions by their lives of self-sacrifice and their deaths for the cause they had taken up, who had been honored and favored and dowered with gifts and privileges in gratitude for their exploits, should suddenly have fallen into the blackest crimes. So it is no less difficult to understand how public opinion should turn against them as it did, and how all Europe should set itself to disgrace and despoil, to malign and execrate those who had so long been its favorites and its champions. It is not easy to understand this, and it is painful to read the story in its sad and miserable details. But there are other pages of history that more or less correspond with this, and there are well-known characteristics of human nature that explain how such revulsions of feeling come about. It has never been found difficult to get up a case against those whom the great and powerful have made up their minds to destroy. The best men are fallible and have their weak side. Large bodies of men must contain some unworthy members. A long history can hardly be without blots, mistakes, and crimes. After the loss of Acre, a chapter of the surviving Templars was gathered, and James de Molay, preceptor of England, was elected Grand Master. One more attempt was made to recover a footing in the Holy Land, but it was defeated with great loss to the order, and all hope of restoring the Latin kingdom in Palestine seems to have been abandoned. The occupation of the Templars was gone. They had been banded together to fight upon the sacred soil of Palestine and to defend pilgrims, but now they had been driven out of the country, and they could no longer execute their mission or fulfill their vows. But the real cause of the downfall of the Templars was probably the enormous wealth of the order. There had not been wanting indications for some years of covetous eyes and itching hands turned toward the possession of the knights. Sometimes complaints were made because the rents of their estates were all sent out of the country. Sometimes the grievance alleged was that they were exempted from paying taxes and other levies, civil and ecclesiastical. Sometimes open acts of spoliation were committed upon their property, and that even by royal hands. But it was in France that the final attack was made. Philip the Fair was king at this time, a man of bad character and unscrupulous as to the means by which he attained his ends. The country was exhausted and the treasury empty, and the idea seems to have occurred to him, as it did later to Henry V of England under similar circumstances, that an easy way to fill his own purse was to put his hand into the purses of others. But even kings cannot appropriate the property of a religious order without offering some apology or justification to the world. And so it began to be whispered that the Holy Land would never have been lost to Christendom if its sworn defenders had not failed in their Christian character. The whole blame of the defeat of the Crusades was laid upon the Templars. It was said they had treacherously betrayed the Christian cause, that they had treated with the enemy, and by their personal sins, especially by secret unhallowed rites, had provoked the just wrath of God, and so brought about the ruin of the dominion of the cross in the East. But even a king could not ruin a great religious order without the aid of the ecclesiastical authorities. The Templars had always been favored and protected by the popes, and nothing was in itself so likely to evoke that protection again as an attack upon the order by the secular powers. But Philip was prepared for this. The Pope of the day, Clement V, had been a subject of his own. As Bishop of Bordeaux, he owed his election to the pontificate to Philip's own intrigues, and had been easily induced to quit Rome and live in France so as to be more completely under the dictation of the king. Moreover, the majority of the cardinals were also French and entirely devoted to the king's interests. Clement V was one of the worst of those miserable men who have from time to time disgraced the papal chair and was guilty of almost every crime. There are indeed authorities worthy of credit who assert that before his election he had been made to promise to perform 6 favors to the king, and that the last was not to be divulged till the time for its execution came. This last was then found to be the suppression of the Order of the Templars. Accordingly, in 1307, Philip issued letters to his officers throughout the kingdom, commanding them to seize all the Templars on a certain day, that they might be tried for crimes of which he and the Pope had satisfied themselves they were guilty. They had apostatized from the Christian religion, worshipped idols in their secret meetings, and had been guilty of horrible and shameful offenses against God, the Church, the state, and humanity itself. Philip professed the most pious horror at what he had discovered. He lamented the grievous necessity laid upon him and urged upon the guilty men the expediency of a full and immediate confession of their wicked doings as the only way to secure pardon and escape the just and extreme penalty of such outrageous wickedness. It was during the night of October 13, 1307, that the king's orders were executed. Every house of the Templars in the dominions of the King of France was suddenly surrounded by a strong force, and all the knights and members of the order were simultaneously taken prisoners. At the same time, a strenuous endeavor was made to arouse popular indignation against the order. The regular and secular clergy were commanded to preach against the Templars and to describe the horrible enormities that were practiced among them. It is incredible to us in these days that such charges should be made, and still more that they should actually be believed. It was said that the Templars worshipped some hideous idol in their secret assemblies, that they offered sacrifices to it of infants and young girls, and that although everyone saw them devout, charitable, and regular in their religious duties, people were not to be misled by these things, for this was only a cloak intended to deceive the world and conceal their secret rites and obscene orgies. It was hoped that some confession of guilt might be readily obtained from some of the weaker brethren in order to receive the pardon which was promised by the king. But no such confession was made. All the prisoners denied the charges brought against them. Then the usual medieval expedient was resorted to, and torture was used to extort acknowledgments of guilt. The unhappy Templars in Paris were handed over to the tender mercies of the tormentors, with the usual results. 140 were subjected to trial by fire. The details preserved are too horrible to be related here, save to say that every cruelty that a horrible ingenuity could invent was used. While this was going on, questions were asked, and offers of pardon were made if they would acknowledge themselves or others, guilty of the monstrous wickednesses which were detailed to them. At the same time, forged letters were read, purporting to come from the Grand Master himself, exhorting them to make a full confession, and declarations were made of the confessions which were said to have been already freely given by other members of the order. Those who had strong will and indomitable courage stood firm and endured the slow martyrdom till death released them, maintaining to the last their own innocence and the innocence of their order, of the crimes with which they were charged. But some weaker men broke down in hope of release from the agony which they could not endure. They confessed anything and everything that was required of them, and these things were at once written down as grave facts and made matter of accusation of others. Often these unhappy men almost immediately recanted, and as soon as the torture ceased, withdrew their confessions and repeated their original denial of the accusations one and all. All this was but too sadly exemplified in the proceedings against the Templars in France. No sooner were those who had made confessions of guilt while under torture released from their tormentors than they disavowed their forced admissions and proclaimed their innocence and the purity of their order, appealing to history and the testimony of their own day for evidence of their courage and devotion to the Catholic faith. Upon hearing of this, Philip immediately ordered the rearrest of the Templars, and proceeding against them as relapsed heretics, they were condemned to be burned alive. In Paris alone, 113 suffered this terrible punishment, and many more were burned in other towns. In Spain, Portugal, and Germany, proceedings were taken against the order. Their property was confiscated, and in some cases, torture was used. But it is remarkable that it was only in France and in those places where Philip's influence was powerful that any Templar was actually put to death. Everywhere else, the monstrous charges were declared to be unproved, and the order was declared innocent of heresy and sacrilegious rites. In October 1311, a council was held at Vienna to dissolve the Order of the Temple, but the majority of the bishops were decidedly opposed to such a proceeding against so ancient and illustrious an order till its members had been heard in their own defense in a fair and open trial. The Pope was furious at this and dismissed the council, and in the following year, 1312, by a papal brief, abolished the order and forbade its reconstitution. The property of the order in France was nominally made over to the Hospitallers, but Philip laid claim to an immense sum for the expenses of the prosecution, and by this and other means he obtained what he had all along desired, the greatest part of the possessions of the order. In France, the Templars who survived their torture and the horrors of their prisons were either executed or left to linger out a miserable existence in their dungeons till death released them. The Grand Master and a few other brethren of the highest rank were thus kept in prison for 5 years. They were then taken to Notre Dame in Paris and required to give verbal assent to the confessions which had been extorted from them under torture. On one side appeared the 2 cardinals, on the other the 4 noble prisoners in chains under the custody of the Provost of Paris. Years of dreary imprisonment had passed over their heads. Of their valiant brethren, the most valiant had been burned alive. The recreants had purchased their lives by confession. The Pope, in a full council, had condemned and dissolved the order. If a human mind, a mind like that of Dumoulin, could be broken by suffering and humiliation, it must have yielded to this long and crushing imprisonment. The Cardinal Archbishop of Albi ascended a raised platform. He read the confessions of the knights, the proceedings of the court. He enlarged on the criminality of the order, on the holy justice of the Pope, and the devout self-sacrificing zeal of the king. He was proceeding to the final, the fatal sentence. At that instant, the Grand Master advanced. His gesture implored silence. Judges and people gazed in awestruck apprehension. In a calm, clear voice, Dumoulin spoke.
Before heaven and earth, on the verge of death, where the least falsehood bears like an intolerable weight upon the soul, I protest that we have richly deserved death, not on account of any heresy or sin of which ourselves or our order have been guilty, but because we have yielded, to save our lives, to the seductive words of the Pope and of the King, and so by our confessions brought shame and ruin on our blameless, holy, and orthodox brotherhood.
The cardinals stood confounded. The people could not suppress their profound sympathy. The assembly was hastily broken up. The provost was commanded to conduct the prisoners back to their dungeons. But on the moment that the king heard these things, without a day's delay, without the least consultation with the ecclesiastical authorities, he ordered them to death as relapsed heretics.